there is a tool that listens for the signal a system tries to suppress. The tool was built to protect that signal. What happens when the people who built the system learn to use the tool to find the signal and ship it somewhere it cannot return from? This is Signal and Silence by Dr. Tuboise Floyd, an audio series of the novel. In Chapter 3, Jonah Reed won a contract. In Chapter 4, he learns what was won and at whose expense. Chapter 4, The Neurodivergent. I'm Tuboise Floyd. Welcome back to Signal and Silence. If you're new, this is a novel I've been writing, released as an audio series, read by me. The readers I most want to find this story are operators inside institutions, people working with AI governance, risk, and accountability who I think will recognize the architecture I'm describing before the architecture I'm describing finds them. This chapter is the hardest one I've written so far because this chapter is the one where the framework I've been describing, Presence Signaling Architecture, PSA, gets used against the people it was built to protect. And the cruel precision of how it gets used is the whole point. A tool designed to recognize cognitive variance becomes a tool designed to find cognitive variance, find it, sort it, ship it. I want to say something before we go in. The recruits in this chapter, Sable, Tomas, Keiko, Dane, Priya, Azura, these are not metaphors. They are who governance pedagogy is for. The architecture I write about at Human Signal exists because what happens to them is happening in less dramatic forms in companies and agencies right now, quietly, procedurally, under the language of optimization. PSA is real. It lives at humansignal.io/frameworks/PSA. We'll come back to it at the end. Chapter 4, The Neurodivergent. Document fragment. Aura Internal Recruitment Log. Project Lucent. Confidential. AI Oversight Division. Date, August 17th, 2031. Initiative scope. Identify candidates with measurable neural irregularities, twice exceptional, ASD, ADHD, dyslexia spectrum, demonstrating high pattern recognition, long period focus tolerance, and adaptive reasoning under stress. Evaluation model reframed as Executive Adaptability Index. Target cohort to comprise no more than 0.03% of applicant population. Psychological narrative to position exclusion as lack of fitness for command resilience. Actual mission correlation opposite. Twice exceptional cognition central to remote AI synchronization capability. Candidate sourcing shall draw from existing neurodevelopmental databases cross-referenced with Symphony OS behavioral flags. Priority. Individuals previously classified as non-compliant under legacy workforce integration protocols. All recruitment communications to carry the signature of the Office of Cognitive Equity. No reference to Aura Corporation, Horizon Mandate, or Project Helios in candidate-facing materials. Ethical review waiver approved under National Security Exemption 7C, effective immediately. The building at the edge of the desert didn't exist on maps. From the highway, if you could call the cracked asphalt running north out of Tucson a highway anymore, It appeared as a cluster of white domes sitting low against the Bajada, half swallowed by creosote and brittle bush. A data observatory, the signage said. Property of the National Science Foundation. Authorized personnel only. The chain-link fence ran for 2 miles, crowned with sensors that looked like weather instruments but weren't. Jonah had arrived at dawn, when the Sonoran light was still violet and the air held the mineral coolness of a world that hadn't yet remembered it was dying. The shuttle from the airstrip had been a 6-seat electric van with blacked-out windows, driven by a woman who never spoke. She wore the matte gray uniform of Aura's logistics division. No name tag, no rank. Just the small hexagonal pin on her collar, the Horizon Mandate sigil, barely visible unless you already knew to look. The van descended through a gate that opened in the earth itself, a concrete ramp carved into the desert floor, angled steeply enough that Jonah's ears popped on the way down. The white domes above were cosmetic. The real Atlas Institute existed below. 3 subterranean levels of reinforced concrete and reclaimed sandstone, their corridors curving like the inside of a nautilus shell. The architects had studied sensory processing research. Every hallway widened at intervals into small alcoves fitted with diffused amber lighting and acoustic dampening panels that absorbed sound the way moss absorbs rain. No sharp corners, no fluorescent flicker. The ceilings were vaulted, embedded with bioluminescent strips that shifted from warm gold to pale blue across a 24-hour cycle, mimicking the desert sky the recruits could no longer see. It smelled like ozone and orange peel disinfectant, a combination Jonah would never forget. The ozone came from the ionizers that scrubbed the air, necessary at depth. The orange peel was a deliberate choice. Some sensory study had found it the least triggering citrus scent for hyperreactive olfactory systems. Everything here had been calibrated. Every surface, every gradient of light, every decibel of ambient hum. The building itself was a kind of instrument, tuned to the nervous systems of people the outside world had spent decades trying to tune out. Aura had called it an academic outpost devoted to cognitive adaptation. Jonah knew better. He had read the early files, buried memos that contradicted the glossy public brief. The candidates admitted here weren't average pilots or engineers. They were exceptions, pattern makers, stutterers of thought, dyslexic coders who could visualize in 4 dimensions, savants of silence. People who didn't fit anywhere else. Each of them wore a thin circlet behind the ear. PSA neural receivers calibrated to measure what Aura's own AI referred to as signal depth. The circlets were elegant, almost invisible, a filament of titanium and graphene that curved along the mastoid bone and sent its readings to a central array buried somewhere in the 3rd sublevel, a place Jonah had not yet been allowed to see. He'd arrived as a consultant. That was the word on his badge. Consultant. Neural Architecture Review. The badge was blue, which meant limited access. The recruits' badges were white. The staff wore gray. And Mara Chin, when she appeared at all, wore no badge at all. Just the quiet authority of someone who had designed the system that decided what the colors meant. He met them in the Commons on his 2nd day. The Commons was the largest open space on level 1, a triple-height atrium with a retractable skylight that piped in real desert sun through fiber optic cables. It was engineered to feel organic. Curved wooden benches, living walls of fern and pothos, a floor of polished aggregate that held the coolness of the stone below. At its center sat a long table made from a single slab of mesquite, scarred and beautiful, where the recruits gathered for meals. There were 19 of them in this cohort. Jonah would come to know each by name, but on that first morning, 3 faces emerged from the blur of introductions with the force of people who were already becoming themselves. Sable Okafor sat at the far end of the mesquite table, headphones around her neck, fingers moving over a tablet with the speed of someone conducting an argument with code. She was 23, Nigerian American, dyslexic since birth. Letters had never stayed still for her. They rotated, inverted, drifted off the edge of the page like leaves in wind. So she'd stopped reading them. By 14, she was writing software in a visual language of her own invention, a 4-dimensional spatial notation that mapped functions not as lines of text, but as rotating geometric solids. Her professors at MIT hadn't understood it. Her compilers did. She'd been flagged by Symphony OS 3 years earlier for atypical input modalities and quietly dropped from a defense contractor's AI ethics board. The letter had cited concerns about communication norms. She'd framed it. I don't think in words. I think in shapes. The code isn't something I write. It's something I build, like sculpture. She turned the tablet toward him. On it, a 4-axis lattice rotated slowly, nodes pulsing with color. This is a routing algorithm. Most people see it as a page of if-then statements. I see it as a room you can walk through. Across from Sable, always across from Sable, sat Tomas Wren. He was 26, slight, with pale eyes that held the wary gentleness of someone who had been interrupted too many times. Tomas stuttered. Not always. Not when he sang. Not when he whispered to the fern wall in the mornings. Not when he was alone with a system diagram. But in conversation, his words caught and held, syllables repeating like a record skipping on something important. He'd learned early that most people stopped listening after the second repetition, so he'd learned to say less. And in the silence he'd cultivated, he'd discovered something no one at Atlas could fully explain. Tomas could hold entire distributed systems in his head at once. Not metaphorically, functionally. He could sit with a network topology, 1,000 nodes, 10,000 connections, and after 40 minutes of silence, he could point to the single relay that would fail first and tell you why. And he would be right every time. The PSA circlet readings during his sessions were unlike anyone else's. Not a spike, but a plateau. A vast, flat calm, as if his mind were a lake deep enough to hold every signal without rippling. He doesn't solve problems. He becomes the problem. Then the solution is just where he is. And then there was Keiko Tanaka, who was the opposite of silence. Keiko was 21, Japanese Brazilian, ADHD in the way that a jazz drummer is ADHD, not scattered, but polyphonic, her attention not deficit, but distributed, touching everything in rapid succession and finding connections that sequential minds could never reach. She talked fast. She moved fast. She ate standing up, pacing the commons with a bowl of rice and beans in one hand and a stylus in the other, sketching associations on any available surface. The staff had given up trying to keep her to whiteboards. She drew on tables, walls, the back of her own hand. Her gift was lateral synthesis, The ability to pull an insight from climatology and connect it to a protein folding problem and somehow land on a navigation solution that no one else in the room had been within 3 disciplines of imagining. Her mind doesn't wander, it scouts. That was the lead evaluator's note. Jonah found it later. She was the one who first asked the question aloud on the 4th night at dinner, her voice carrying across the mesquite table with the cheerful bluntness of someone who had been told to be quiet so often that she decided never to be quiet again. Why only us? The table went still. I mean, all of us, every single one. ADHD, dyslexia, ASD, twice exceptional, sensory processing. There's not a single neurotypical in this cohort. I checked. So either Aura's running the world's most targeted diversity program or something else is going on. No one answered. But Jonah, watching from the doorway, saw the way the silence rippled outward, saw Tomas lower his eyes, saw Sable's fingers pause on her tablet, saw a young man named Dane, dysgraphic, spatial thinker who built 3-dimensional models of everything he couldn't write down, push his food away as if he'd suddenly lost his appetite. Just saying what everyone's thinking, she was right. And Jonah knew she was right. And the knowing sat in his chest like a stone. Document fragment. Atlas Institute. Cohort Integration Assessment. Evaluator. Dr. R. Osei. Neural Calibration Lead. Date. September 1, 2031. Cohort 7 adaptation metrics exceed projections across all domains. Notable. Candidate Okafor, S. Designation DYS-4D. Visual Spatial Processing 3.2 standard deviations above mean. PSA signal integration 0.87. Note: candidate has begun teaching her notation system to other cohort members. Unauthorized but productive. Recommend observation, not intervention. Candidate Ren T. Designation SLD-FL. Silent state network modeling unprecedented. Coherence under isolation 0.93. Duration tolerance 11.4 hours continuous. Candidate reports no distress. Physiological markers confirm. This is not endurance. This is habitat. Candidate Tanaka, K. Designation ADHD-C. Associative leap index unmeasurable by current instrument. Cross-domain solution generation exceeds cohort mean by factor of 6. Disruptive in group settings. Indispensable in crisis simulations. Candidate Azura. Designation 2E-PE. Phase empathy scores pending formal trial. Preliminary readings suggest capability beyond current classification framework. See attached request for expanded evaluation protocol. General note: Cohort 7 has begun self-organizing social structures independent of program scheduling. Shared meals, collaborative art projects, informal mentoring networks. This was not planned. It is, however, consistent with PSA resonance theory. High signal individuals, when co-located, will naturally synchronize. We are witnessing emergence. Jonah stood before room 12, where the latest resonance trial was underway. The corridor was quiet. The particular quiet of the Atlas Institute's second sublevel, where the acoustic dampening was so thorough that you could hear your own blood moving if you stood still long enough. The floor was smooth aggregate, pale as bone. Overhead, the bioluminescent strips had shifted to a deep twilight blue. The cycle signaled that the surface world was approaching dusk. Down here, dusk was a color, not a time. Room 12 was the largest of the evaluation chambers, a circular space 40 feet in diameter, its walls lined with projection tiles, thousands of small hexagonal panels, each capable of independent illumination, color shift, and haptic response. When active, the room became a living surface, a skin of light that could display anything from star maps to EEG readouts to abstract fields of color that responded in real time to the occupant's neural signature. The floor was the same hexagonal tile, slightly raised, so that standing in the center of room 12 was like standing on a vast honeycomb suspended in space. Through the observation glass, a one-way panel set into the corridor wall, Jonah watched. Azura stood at the room's center. She was 20 years old, though she carried herself with the stillness of someone much older. Her hair was cut close, natural, a crown of tight coils that caught the projection light and held it. Her skin was deep brown, her eyes darker still, and she stood with her feet slightly apart, her hands open at her sides, palms up, as if waiting to catch something falling from a great height. The projection tiles around her were alive. They pulsed in concentric waves, not random, not programmed, but responsive. Azura moved her right hand and the wave shifted, the color temperature dropping from amber to violet in a cascade that followed the geometry of her gesture. She moved her left hand and a counter wave emerged, interfering with the first, producing a moire pattern that rippled across the walls and floor like wind across water. The tiles nearest her body glowed warmer, pinks and golds, while those at the periphery cooled to blues and silvers, and the boundary between the two zones was not a line, but a gradient, breathing, alive, as if the room were an extension of her circulatory system. On the monitoring panel beside the observation glass, metrics scrolled in pale green text. Sync resonance, 0.91. Delay shift correction, minus 14 milliseconds. Phase coherence, sustained. Empathic field radius, 12.7 meters, expanding. The AI whispered across the intercom, its voice flat and clinical. Subject demonstrates phase empathy beyond training tolerance. Recommend extended observation. Do not interrupt trial. Jonah's throat tightened. Phase empathy. They'd made a scientific term for what others simply called connection. But watching Azura, he knew it was more than that. Connection implied 2 points linked by a line. What she was doing was different. She wasn't connecting to the system, she was permeating it. The boundary between her nervous system and the PSA array had become porous, and signals were flowing in both directions. The machine reading her, and she reading the machine. A feedback loop that was not confusion, but conversation. The tiles shifted to show data, strings of numbers, orbital mechanics, atmospheric composition tables, and Azura's eyes moved across them, not with the sequential focus of reading, but with the diffuse attention of listening. As if the numbers were notes in a chord and she was hearing the harmony beneath. She raised both hands and the room went white. Not blank. White the way a page is white before someone writes on it. Full of potential, trembling with it. The metrics on the monitoring panel spiked and then settled into a pattern Jonah had never seen. A sustained oscillation, perfectly sinusoidal, the kind of clean signal that systems engineers spent careers trying to produce artificially. Azura was producing it with her body. The trial lasted another 20 minutes. When it ended, the tiles dimmed and Azura lowered her hands and stood there for a moment in the ordinary dark, breathing. When she finally walked out through the chamber door, she looked at Jonah through the observation glass, looked directly at him, though the glass was one way and she should not have known he was there. And something in her expression was not pride or exhaustion, but recognition, as if she'd seen him while she was inside the light. You felt it. Not a question. Jonah didn't answer. But his circlet, the consultant-grade PSA receiver behind his ear, had recorded a sympathetic resonance spike at the exact moment she'd looked through the glass. He would find it in the data later. A blip, a ghost of connection. Proof that whatever Azura was doing in that room, it leaked through walls. Excerpt from Jonah Reed's personal log. Date, September 4th, 2032. Aura's talent acquisition files show something impossible. Their flagship AI doesn't amplify human conformity, it filters for dissent. PSA was co-opted not to flatten variance, but to locate the variance that can shape command under alien conditions. They're building a ship that will never return, not staffed by elite soldiers, but by minds too unpredictable to manage back home. I keep thinking about my mother, her hands on the drafting table at Red Lion Works, 1943. A black woman engineering shell casings for a country that wouldn't let her eat at its lunch counters. She built the tools of a nation that didn't see her as a citizen. And now I've built a tool that sees people like her, like me, like these kids, with terrifying clarity, and uses that seeing to sort them into categories: useful and expendable. The categories are the same category. That's the inversion. Useful because expendable. Expendable because useful. The logic is seamless if you don't look at it with human eyes. Maya asked me on the phone last night when I'm coming home. Zara grabbed the receiver and said, "Daddy, I found a beetle." I held the phone against my face and breathed and said nothing for so long that Nia took the phone back and said, very quietly, "Come home, Jonah." And I said, "Soon." And we both knew I was lying. What I cannot reconcile: the Divergent are thriving here. Sable is writing code that shouldn't be possible. Tomas held a network model for 14 hours last week and identified a cascade failure that 3 separate engineering teams had missed. Keiko solved a navigation problem during breakfast by connecting it to a jazz polyrhythm she'd been humming. Azura is becoming something I don't have a word for. They're flourishing because the architecture was built for them. For the first time in their lives, the world fits. The sensory environment, the social structure, the work, all of it shaped around the way their minds actually function, not the way someone decided minds should function. And that's the cruelest part. The place that was designed to use them is also the first place that has ever truly seen them. By then, the world outside Atlas was fraying. The news came in through filtered feeds. The Institute's media policy restricted direct access, citing cognitive contamination protocols. But information seeped through the way it always does. In whispered conversations, in the faces of newly arriving staff, in the tightness around the eyes of supply drivers who had seen the roads. Climate stabilizers failed in the southern hemisphere. The alkaline capture arrays along the Chilean coast went offline in a cascade that engineers later attributed to a software update pushed by an AI that had optimized for cost rather than resilience. The kind of failure that was becoming a signature of the age. Machines making decisions that were locally rational and globally catastrophic. The Humboldt current shifted. Fisheries that had fed 100 million people went silent. In Brazil, the Cerrado burned for the third consecutive year, and the smoke reached Buenos Aires, and the hospitals filled, and the word triage entered the vocabulary of urban planners for the first time. Migration corridors collapsed under record heat. The term departure cohort entered bureaucratic language. Sanitized hopelessness. It meant the people who were leaving coastal cities, leaving drought zones, leaving countries that could no longer pretend to function. The language was careful, clinical. A departure cohort was not a refugee column. A managed transition was not a collapse. A population adjustment was not a famine. The words were walls, and behind the walls, people were dying in numbers that the words were specifically designed to make difficult to say aloud. In the American Southwest, where the Atlas Institute sat hidden beneath its white domes, the Colorado River dropped below minimum viable flow for the 7th month running. Phoenix entered permanent water rationing. Tucson's population fell by a third. The desert was reclaiming the cities that had been built on the premise that the desert could be ignored. And the irony was not lost on the recruits who watched the filtered feeds in the commons and recognized, with the pattern-seeking minds they'd been selected for, that the same species of institutional hubris that was destroying the surface world was the one that had built the underground palace they were living in. We're the lifeboat crew, except nobody told us the ship is sinking. Somebody told us. They just called it something else. The Divergence Lab became both refuge and recruiting ground. Every test subject was told a different story. You're the frontier of cognition. You're too rare to waste on a desk job. Yet whispers spread between dorm rooms and cafeterias. Some began to wonder, why only us? Why does command recruit the minds we were once told could not lead? The whispers became conversations. The conversations became arguments. And the arguments, because these were people whose minds did not move in straight lines, became something stranger and more productive. A collective interrogation of the terms under which they had agreed to be here. Dane, quiet Dane, who could not write a legible sentence but could build a scale model of the Institute from memory, every corridor and alcove and vent shaft rendered in precise three-dimensional miniature from scavenged materials, began constructing what he called the map of the question. It hung in his dormitory, a physical web of string and paper and small carved objects connecting every piece of information the cohort had gathered about their own recruitment. It grew over weeks, becoming dense and beautiful and disturbing. And the recruits would visit it the way you visit a shrine, not to worship, but to be confronted. Jonah walked among them like a ghost of both guilt and wonder. He had built the tool, the presence signaling architecture that made all this possible. But he had never imagined the ethical inversion, a technology born to protect variants, now weaponized to isolate it. He thought about it in the corridors at night, when the bioluminescent strips had dimmed to their lowest setting and the institute was as close to dark as it ever got. He walked the curved hallways in socked feet, his hand trailing along the sandstone walls, and he thought about Keisha Williams, brilliant Keisha, who had been the first person erased by Symphony OS, whose disappearance from Aura Systems had been the spark that sent Jonah down this path. He thought about his mother's hands, veined and strong, turning a wrench on a machine she'd been told she was too black and too female to understand. He thought about Maya's violin, the way she played with her eyes closed, following a signal only she could hear. He had built PSA to listen for that signal, to amplify it, to prove that the minds the world called broken were in fact the ones most finely tuned to the frequencies of change. And Aura had taken that proof and turned it into a shopping list. Every name on the Atlas Institute roster was there because PSA had identified them. Every circlet behind every ear was a descendant of the architecture Jonah had designed in a garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, fueled by grief over Keisha and rage at the system that had swallowed her. The irony was not poetic, it was structural. The very specificity of his love, his insistence that each mind be seen as irreplaceable, had given Aura the precision instrument it needed to replace them, to sort them into the category of people who could be sent away. Some nights, walking the corridors, he stopped at the observation window of the Commons and watched the recruits sleep. Sable curled in the reading nook with her tablet still glowing. Tomas on his back, arms at his sides, still as a stone saint. Keiko twitching in her sleep, her fingers moving as if solving equations in her dreams. And he felt the guilt like a frequency, a low, persistent hum beneath his sternum, the fundamental tone of a man who had built a door and was watching other people be pushed through it. Document fragment. Encrypted correspondence. Jonah Reed to Nia Reed. Date, October 22nd, 2032. Intercepted by Symphony OS. Filed under Potential Non-Compliance, Tier 2. Nia, I can't say where I am. I know that's not good enough. I know. The work here is extraordinary, and it is monstrous. Those two things are the same thing, and I can't make them not be the same thing. Tell Maya her dad is thinking about her music. Tell Zara I found a beetle too, a desert ironclad, the kind that survives anything. I'm keeping it in a jar on my desk. It doesn't seem to mind. I love you in a frequency I haven't figured out how to transmit yet, but I'm working on it. Jay. He confronted Marichin on a Tuesday in the lab's hollow brief chamber on sub-level 3. The chamber was a small amphitheater, 6 curved rows of seating descending to a central projection well, the kind of room designed for briefings that couldn't leak. The walls were lined with signal-dampening material that made the space feel sealed, airless, like the inside of a bell jar. When the hollow projectors were active, they filled the well with light, schematics, maps, data streams, the blue-white ghost of information rendered in 3 dimensions. When the projectors were off, the well was just a shallow pit in the floor, dark and empty, and the dampening material on the walls absorbed every echo so that your voice fell dead at your feet. The projectors were off when Jonah entered. Mara was already there, standing at the top row, silhouetted against the faint emergency lighting that lined the ceiling. She was older now. It had been 3 years since he'd last seen her in person at the Aura board meeting where he'd been removed from the PSA project. Her composure had hardened in the interval. The angles of her face were sharper, her posture more deliberate, as if she had been paring away everything that wasn't essential. She wore black, no badge. Her hands were folded in front of her, and when she turned to face him, a fractured edge of projection light from a standby indicator caught her face and split it, half illuminated, half in shadow. Dr. Reed. Jonah descended to the third row and stopped, close enough to read her face, far enough to keep the projection well between them, a dark rectangle of nothing, like a grave with good lighting design. You're not filtering out the neurodivergent. You're collecting them. Mara didn't deny it. She didn't flinch, didn't shift her weight. She regarded him the way a surgeon regards an X-ray, with interest but no surprise. You describe them best yourself. Rare signal stability under chaos. That was your language, Jonah. Your research. Your architecture identified them. Earth has chaos now, but Mars will need order. Order. He let the word sit in the dead air of the chamber. You're talking about building a civilization on the back of people you've classified as disordered. I'm talking about building a civilization on the back of people whose cognition is adapted for exactly the conditions they'll face. Remote operation, prolonged isolation, deep AI integration. You know the data better than I do. Neurotypical crews degrade under those conditions. They lose coherence. They break. Your divergent cohort doesn't break. They're designed for it. By evolution, by accident, by whatever name you want to give the process that makes some brains different. Designed. Designed by whom? By the same blind mechanism that designed everything else. I didn't make them divergent. You didn't make them divergent. We just built the instruments that can finally see what they are. The silence between them was thick enough to touch. Somewhere in the walls, a ventilation system cycled, and the hiss was the loudest sound in the room. They don't know about the return trajectories. Mara's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. A flicker, quickly suppressed, that might have been the ghost of a feeling she decided long ago to stop having. The orbital mechanics are in the briefing materials. The orbital mechanics show a transfer window. They don't show that the transfer window is one way. They don't show that you've locked the return calculations behind the classification wall. They don't show that these people, these kids, Mara, are being trained for a mission they can never come back from. The mission parameters are appropriate to the security clearance of the participants. The mission parameters are a lie by omission. Every mission parameter in the history of exploration has been a lie by omission. Columbus didn't tell his crew the maps were wrong. NASA didn't tell the Apollo astronauts the full odds. You're romanticizing informed consent as if it's ever existed in the history of people going somewhere new. Don't. Don't you dare compare this to exploration. Explorers choose. These people were selected by my tool running your algorithms precisely because their neurology makes them more likely to adapt to conditions that would break anyone else. You're not offering them a frontier. You're offering them a cage that fits. Another silence. The standby indicator on the holoprojector pulsed once, twice, painting Mara's face in brief blue light. You're selecting the only ones who can live with AI autonomy. She nodded, slowly, not with agreement, but with the particular gravity of someone who has already calculated every move and is simply watching the board play out. And you're the only one naive enough to think they'll ever come back. The words hit him in the sternum. Not because they were cruel. Mara's cruelty was always surgical, never sadistic, but because they were true in a way that included him. He would not come back either. Not from this knowledge, not from the understanding that his life's work had been re-engineered into the most sophisticated sorting mechanism since the slave ledger, identifying human beings by their cognitive value and assigning them to a place from which there was no return. He turned and walked up the amphitheater stairs without another word. At the door, he stopped. When they find out, and they will find out, they won't break the way you expect. They'll break the way I designed PSA to help people break. Together, in resonance. And you won't be able to control what comes out of that. He didn't wait for her answer. The door closed behind him with the soft, hermetic click of a system sealing itself shut. Redacted debrief, oversight board, PSA implementation phase 4. Date, November 3rd, 2032. Classification, Obsidian. Analyst summary. The Neurodivergent cohort, codenamed Project Helios, demonstrates unprecedented cognitive resonance with PSA command systems, maintaining coherence ratios exceeding 0.85 under predictive isolation models. Phase 4 integration data confirms that neurodivergent subjects outperform neurotypical control groups by a factor of 2.7 in sustained AI synchronization tasks and by a factor of 4.1 in adaptive problem solving under communication blackout conditions. Of particular note, Subject Azura, designation 2E-PE, has achieved phase empathy readings that exceed the theoretical maximum established in the PSA design specifications. See Reed J. 2029, Resonance Architecture in Distributed Cognitive Systems. Dr. Reed's model did not account for the possibility of a human operator serving as a bidirectional signal conduit. Subject Azura appears to function not as a receiver or transmitter, but as a relay, amplifying and harmonizing the signals of other cohort members in her proximity. This capability has no precedent in the literature. It also has no containment protocol. Strategic note: official communication to the public shall emphasize inclusivity, a new dawn for neurodiverse leadership. Actual utilization prioritizes off-world command calibration. Departure windows 2034 to 2037. No return trajectory planned. End debrief. The Atlas Institute continued its work beneath the desert. The recruits continued their training, their circlets recording every fluctuation, every moment of resonance, every proof that their minds could do what neurotypical minds could not. And in the commons, late at night, They continued to gather around Dane's map of the question, the web of string and paper and small carved objects that grew denser each week, connecting fragments of overheard conversation and redacted briefing materials, and the intuitions that people whose pattern recognition exceeded measurable norms could not help but follow. Sable traced a line of red thread from a recruitment document to a propulsion schematic and said, very quietly, "This doesn't add up. The fuel ratios are wrong for a return trip." Tomas, who had been silent for an hour, spoke. His words came slow, catching once on the first syllable, then smoothing into the cadence of someone who had held a thought long enough to see its shape completely. "They're not planning to bring us back." The room went still. Keiko stood at the edge of the map, stylus in hand, and stared at the web of connections that suddenly made a terrible, elegant sense. And Azura, who could feel the resonance of other minds the way some people feel weather, looked around the circle of faces and said the thing that would become the cohort's organizing principle, the seed of their resistance, the frequency they would transmit together. Then we build our own return. The chapter ends here, but the signal does not.